The summer sun crept above the rooftops of London, casting long shadows across narrow lanes and timbered houses. Normally, mornings in the capital began with a familiar medley of sound: the rattle of cartwheels over cobblestones, the shouts of fishmongers competing for customers, the sharp crack of a cooper's mallet from some distant workshop. But on this August day, those noises seemed strangely muted, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Word had spread for days, and now it was here, the execution of William Wallace, the most infamous rebel in Christendom. They came in from the countryside at dawn, trudging through the city gates with baskets of bread, barrels of ale, and children in tow, eager to claim a vantage point. Merchants closed their shops early, some out of loyalty to the crown, others because spectacle was good for business. Street vendors abandoned their usual hawking of apples or oysters, placing them with roasted nuts, skewered meats, and spiced wine. Even the Thames seemed to churn with anticipation. Boatmen ferried paying passengers to the north bank, where the best views of the route could be found. The crowd was not a single united voice. There were Londoners who saw Wallace as a savage murderer. His raids into northern England had left farmsteads smoldering and families broken. There were others who had no interest in Scotland's fate, but could not resist the pull of a public killing, a rare diversion from the grind of daily life. And somewhere in that mass, there were quiet watchers, Flemish traders, French envoys, perhaps even a Scot or two, who had come not to jeer, but to bear witness. Over it all hung a carefully crafted sense of theater. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, understood the value of spectacle. This would not be a swift beheading in a shadowed courtyard. No, Wallace's death would be a statement, a living demonstration of what happened when one defied the English. Crowned, the sentence itself was a deliberate orchestration of cruelty, drawn through the streets, hanged until the brink of death, disemboweled, alive, beheaded, and quartered. Even the order of events had symbolic meaning: the dragging for disgrace, the partial hanging for rejection by heaven, the disemboweling to mark the destruction of the rebel's humanity, and the quartering to erase him from the earth. Yet, in the minds of many spectators, the day's event was more than punishment. It was entertainment. Public executions in medieval England were part morality play, part carnival, and part object lesson. The authorities knew this and leaned into it. Stalls selling meat pies and sugared almonds lined the roads. Ale flowed freely. Even before the condemned man appeared, the air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, the sharp tang of horses, and the murmur of thousands of voices. As the sun climbed higher, guards emerged from the Tower of London, their halberds glinting. Behind them came a wooden hurdle, a crude sled of planks to which a man was bound with ropes at wrists and ankles. His clothes had been stripped down to a simple tunic, his hair matted from weeks in a cell. The iron manacles around his wrists had rubbed his skin raw. Even at a distance, you could see that William Wallace was not a broken man, not entirely. His face was pale, the jaw set, the eyes fixed on something far ahead. Some in the crowd jeered immediately, shouting insults about Scots and traitors. Others craned their necks in silence, studying him as though to memorize his features. A few, perhaps those who had lost kin in the northern raids, spat on the cobblestones as he passed. But there were also gasps. Wallace was taller than many expected, broad-shouldered, despite the gauntness of imprisonment. Even now, bound and under guard, there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of defiance. The hurdle jolted forward, pulled by two sturdy horses. The wooden frame scraped and bumped over the cobbles, jerking Wallace's body with each uneven stone. The route wound through the busiest parts of the city, Cheapside, where merchants leaned from upper windows, to watch Fleet Street, where scribes and clerks paused their work to see the man they had read about in royal proclamations. This was no accident. Edward's ministers had plotted the procession like a playwright plots a drama, assuring that no corner of the city would miss the chance to absorb the warning. It would have been easier, kinder, to march him straight to Smithfield. But kindness was not the point. This was ritual humiliation designed to sap whatever dignity remained in the condemned. The dragging itself was punishment. By the time the scaffold loomed into view, Wallace's skin was already scraped and bleeding from the cobbles. Dust clung to his hair, sweat to his face, and still he kept his gaze fixed outward, refusing to meet the eyes of those who mocked him. Somewhere near the head of the procession, an official unfurled a proclamation and began to read aloud. The crimes of William Wallace, traitor to the king's peace, murderer of good English subjects, inciter of rebellion. The words were for the crowd's benefit, a legal chorus to accompany the physical drama. But in the minds of many who listened, the charges carried a certain irony. After all, Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward. If the man on the hurdle was a traitor, it was to the king of a foreign land. The smell of tar hung faintly in the air, a reminder of the fate awaiting Wallace's head, which would be preserved and mounted on London Bridge. The king's justice was thorough. It was not enough to kill a man. Must erase him and display the pieces as a warning. By the time they reached Smithfield, the crowd had swelled into thousands. The scaffold loomed like a dark halter against the pale sky. Wallace was unbound from the hurdle and hauled upward by his guards. Around him, the noise rose to a fever pitch. Laughter, curses, and the clinking of tankards. Somewhere in that chaos, the line between justice and spectacle had already vanished. The man was no longer simply a rebel to be punished, but the central figure in a grim pageant that London would speak of for years. And in that moment, with his life measured now in minutes, William Wallace stood facing the scaffold. The crowd and the vast, implacable power of the English crown. To understand why William Wallace's death mattered so profoundly, we must return to the world that made him a Scotland fractured, uncertain, and standing on the knife's edge between independence and subjugation. The year was 1286 when King Alexander III of Scotland died suddenly, thrown from his horse in the dark along the cliffs near Kinghorn. His unexpected death without a surviving son left the kingdom in a dangerous limbo. Only direct heir was his granddaughter, Margaret, a child living in Norway, known to history as the Maid of Norway. Before she could be crowned, she died on the sea voyage to Scotland. And with her passing came a crisis. No clear ruler and dozens of claimants to the throne. This great cause, as it came to be called, invited for an arbitration in England's. Edward, I saw his opportunity. To him, Scotland was less a sovereign nation than a prize to be folded into his growing dominion. He was a man whose ambitions had already crushed the Welsh and expelled the Jews from England. King, whose understanding of loyalty was simple, obedience or ruin. In 1292, Edward named John Balliol king, but only as a puppet monarch, expecting deference in all matters of governance. It was a humiliation to many Scots, and when Balliol resisted, Edward struck with fury, invading in 1296 and seizing the symbols of Scottish nationhood, including the Stone of Destiny from Scone Abbey. Wallace was not yet a famous figure in these early years. Born around 1270, likely the second son of a minor landowner in Elderslie, his upbringing was modest compared to the great lords of the realm. The Wallace family owed no grand estates, no sprawling castles. Their survival depended on land, loyalty, and the sword when needed. Yet the English occupation reached even into the lives of men like William. The taxation, the garrisons, and the harsh justice of foreign sheriffs eroded the patience of ordinary Scots. Legends abound about Wallace's first open defiance. Some say it began with the killing of an English soldier who insulted him in a market. Others claim it was vengeance for the death of his wife, Marion Braidfeud, allegedly slain by an English sheriff named William Hazelrigg. The historical record offers no certainty, but what is clear is that by 1297, Wallace had taken up arms and gathered a band of men committed to striking at the occupiers. That summer, he and Andrew de Moor led a force that met the English at Stirling Bridge, a place that would etch Wallace's name into legend. The English, confident in their heavy cavalry and superior numbers, underestimated the Scots' tactical cunning. Wallace and Murray used the narrowness of the bridge to trap their enemies, attacking before the bulk of the English could cross. Hemmed in and unable to maneuver, the English knights were slaughtered. The victory was not just military, it was psychological. It proved that the English could be beaten, and that Scotland's cause was not hopeless. The triumph at Stirling Bridge shook Edward I, but Longshanks was a master of war and politics. He responded with overwhelming force the following year, leading his armies north and crushing the Scots at Falkirk in 1298. The long spears that had served Wallace so well could not withstand the English longbow, and the Scottish cavalry, drawn from the nobility, fled early in the battle. Defeat drove Wallace into the shadows. He resigned as Guardian of Scotland and vanished from the main stage of politics. Though he never laid down the fight entirely, in these years after Falkirk, Wallace's status changed. He was no longer a commander in the open field, but a symbol, a man living beyond the reach of English law, moving between sympathizers, relying on secrecy and loyalty in a land where both were dangerous commodities. For Edward, Wallace's continued freedom was an insult and a challenge. Most of Scotland's great lords, men like John Comyn, had already bent the knee to England. To them, Wallace was a dangerous reminder of resistance, a spark that could reignite rebellion at any moment. Edward understood rebellion as he understood fire. It must be extinguished utterly, or it would flare again. He had learned this in Wales, where, even after apparent submission, uprisings could erupt without warning. Wallace had to be more than defeated. He had to be erased, his death turned into a parable of obedience. That decision, made in the king's councils, would set into motion one of the most relentless manhunts of the medieval age. The English crown placed a substantial bounty on Wallace's head, and Edward's network of sheriffs, castellans, and informants spread across Scotland like a net. It was not just military power they wielded, it was the corrosive force of fear. A man could be hanged for sheltering Wallace, a village burned for aiding him. Over time, the number of those willing to help dwindled, not always from treachery, but from the simple will to survive. Yet Wallace endured, evading capture for years. Chroniclers would later debate where he went. Some say he sought allies in France, others that he moved among the glens and forests of Scotland, striking when he could. Each new rumor of his survival kept Edward's anger simmering. By 1305, the king had resolved that this ghost of a man would be brought to him in chains, no matter the cost. The betrayal, when it came, was as old as politics itself. A friend turned informer, Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had submitted to English authority, is the name most often tied to Wallace's capture near Glasgow in August of that year. The details are hazy, perhaps deliberately obscured by those who feared retribution from their countrymen. But the outcome was clear. Wallace, bound and under guard, was finally in English hands. For Edward, it was a personal victory. For Scotland, it was the loss of its most enduring symbol of defiance. And for Wallace, it was the beginning of the long road to London, a road paved not with the hope of rescue, but with the certainty of calculated, merciless punishment. After Stirling Bridge, William Wallace became the most wanted man in the British Isles, not simply an enemy commander, but a political problem, a living rebuke to Edward I's authority. By the time of his final years in hiding, his name was known in every English garrison, whispered in every Scottish tavern, and written into every royal order of pursuit. Wallace's capture was no routine military objective. It was a campaign of its own, fought with gold as much as with steel, and directed from the highest levels of the English crown. Edward understood that Wallace's death needed to be more than the silencing of a dissident. It had to be a masterstroke of propaganda. A quick battle kill would not suffice. The rebel must be paraded, displayed, and crushed in a way that would sap the will of any who dreamed of following him. It meant taking him alive, and that, in the rugged geography and fractured loyalties of medieval Scotland, was no easy feat. By the early 1300s, Wallace no longer commanded large armies. Instead, he lived in the shadows, moving between sympathetic households, remote hamlets, and the wild highlands. His movements were unpredictable, his allies carefully chosen. The old feudal ties that bound men to lords were loosening, replaced by more fragile bonds of necessity and secrecy. He could still inspire small uprisings and lead sudden raids on English convoys. But each strike made him more isolated. The English countered with a methodical campaign. Edwards, sheriffs, and appointed justiciars sent out orders for watchmen in every shire to report sightings of the outlaw. Merchants and travelers moving between burghs were questioned about his whereabouts. Rewards were offered, not modest sums, but life-changing amounts of silver to anyone willing to betray him. In many cases, the pressure was indirect. An English garrison commander might visit a village suspected of sheltering Wallace's men and remind them pointedly of what had happened to others: burned homes, confiscated livestock, hanged kin. It was a brutal calculus for those caught in the middle: loyalty to the cause versus the survival of one's family. Over time, fear eroded solidarity. Wallace's enemies were not only English. Many Scottish nobles, weary of war or eager to protect their estates, saw in his continued resistance a dangerous provocation. They had already sworn oaths to Edward, some in public ceremonies that left no turning back. To them, Wallace was a romantic fool, unwilling to recognize that the fight was over, and worse, his existence risked drawing English wrath back upon the fragile peace they had made. The net closed slowly. Over years, through a mixture of informants, opportunists, and genuine traitors, Wallace must have known that every knock on a door, every invitation to dine, every whispered promise of shelter carried risk. Yet the man who had defied England's might could not simply disappear into obscurity. His cause, the dream of a Scotland free of foreign rule, kept him moving, even as his circle tightened. Then came August 1305. The betrayal, most historians accept, was the work of Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who held the title of Keeper of Dumbarton Castle under English authority. The precise circumstances are shrouded in uncertainty. Some chroniclers claim Menteith invited Wallace to a meeting under the guise of friendship. Others suggest Wallace was simply overpowered while traveling with a small retinue. A few hint at the involvement of servants or lesser men who slipped word to the English in exchange for safety or coin. Whatever the truth, Wallace was taken near Glasgow, bound and delivered into English hands. For Menteith, the reward was not just monetary, it was survival in a political landscape where siding with the winning power was the only guarantee of keeping one's head. For Edward, it was a triumph years in the making. From the moment of his capture, Wallace's fate was sealed. He would not be killed in some remote skirmish or left to rot in a provincial dungeon. His journey south would be slow and deliberate, a moving symbol of Edward's dominance. In each town along the way, people would see the infamous rebel not as the towering warrior of Scottish legend, but as a bound prisoner, dirt on his face and chains on his wrists. King's message would travel with him. Rebellion ends here. There is no record of Wallace begging for mercy, nor of him striking a bargain. If he spoke to his captors on that road, his words are lost to time. But the silence of history on this point has only sharpened the legend. A man taken not by force of arms in open battle, Tade, but by the quieter, deadlier forces of betrayal and political necessity. For the English, the manhunt was over. For Wallace, the true ordeal, the one Edward had been plotting for years, was just beginning. The journey from Glasgow to London was not a prisoner transfer, it was a mobile act of humiliation. Wallace's captors understood that Edward I's orders went beyond mere custody. The rebel knight was to be displayed like a trophy before the people who had once feared his name. Every mile south was part of a carefully staged performance, and Wallace, bound and guarded, was the unwilling centerpiece. They did not travel in haste. The route wound through market towns, fortified burghs, and villages, where the sight of the tall Scot in chains was enough to draw crowds from miles around. In some places, the mood was festive, in others, bitter. Farmers and tradesmen in England's north, who had seen their livelihoods burned during Wallace's raids, hurled curses and spittle in his path. Children were lifted onto shoulders to get a better view of the butcher of the north, as English chroniclers sometimes called him. Yet, among the watchers were also quiet, watchful figures, travelers and merchants from Flanders or France, who recognized the political theater at play, and perhaps even a few Scots. Their faces unreadable. He was shackled with iron cuffs at wrists and ankles, the weight of the chains designed to slow and exhaust him. On some days, he was made to walk in full view of the escort. On others, lashed to a horse or cart for the long hours between towns. The men assigned to guard him were not merely soldiers. They were part escort, part showmen, ensuring that each community along the way could see the rebels' condition for themselves. The procession served two purposes. First, it reinforced Edward's reach. Wallace had been untouchable for years, striking where he pleased and vanishing into Scotland's wild terrain. Now he was on open display, proof that no one could evade the king's justice forever. Second, it chipped away at the man's legend. The Wallace of rumor was a giant slayer, a ghost in the forest. The Wallace of reality, trudging through mud and irons, was all too human. Psychological warfare was as important as physical restraint. The English captors controlled not only Wallace's movements, but his surroundings. I chose when he would see sunlight, when he would eat, when he would speak. The journey was punctuated by deliberate indignities, being kept in crowded, filthy cells at night, being forced to pass through towns in the company of common criminals, being jeered at in marketplaces while chained to a post. The closer they drew to London, the more the performance sharpened. In larger towns like York, the civic authorities staged small ceremonies for the prisoner's arrival, reading aloud proclamations of his crimes. These readings, treason, murder, arson, sacrilege, were for the townsfolk's ears, part of the king's effort to define the narrative before the trial. In truth, Wallace had never sworn loyalty to Edward. But to the English crown that distinction mattered little. Wallace's own thoughts in these weeks are unrecorded. But the medieval mind did not easily separate the physical from the spiritual. In chains, under constant guard, surrounded by jeering crowds, he was meant to feel the weight of defeat, not just in his limbs, but in his soul. Yet eyewitness fragments suggest a man who did not beg. Chroniclers note that he carried himself with a strange composure, his gaze often fixed on the horizon rather than on the faces around him. After weeks on the road, the final approach to London was the most deliberate display of all. The capital streets were already alive with rumor by the time the escort reached the city gates. Boats on the Thames jostled for position to see him pass along the banks. At the new gate entrance, guards slowed the pace so that every onlooker could study the prisoner's face. In that moment, Wallace crossed the invisible threshold between outlaw and spectacle, between man and public lesson. He was taken to the Tower of London, not to be held in the deepest cellars, but to await a trial whose verdict was already written. His arrival there marked the end of the road in one sense, yet it was only the beginning of the last act Edward had so carefully prepared. On the morning of the 23rd of August, 1305, William Wallace was brought from the Tower of London to Westminster Hall, the seat of England's royal justice. The trial that awaited him was not a deliberation, but a ritual, a piece of political theater, in which the law was less an instrument of fairness than a sharpened blade in Edward I's hand. Westminster Hall, even then, was an imposing space, a vast timbered roof, high arched windows spilling pale light onto the flagstones, and rows of benches packed with courtiers, clerics, merchants, and the curious public. Wallace, dragged into the chamber in chains, faced not a jury of peers, but a council presided over by Sir Peter Mallory, the presiding judge, with justices and royal officials arrayed beside him. The air was thick with the scent of wax, damp wool, and anticipation. The charges, read aloud for all to hear, were sweeping and deliberately incendiary: treason for leading, armed rebellion against King Edward I, murder and massacre, for the deaths of English soldiers and civilians during raids in the north, arson for the burning of English garrisons and settlements, sacrilege for allegedly desecrating churches used as English strongholds. The word treason carried a particular weight. Under English law, it meant betraying one's lawful king. But Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward. This was not a legal oversight. It was the entire point. By accusing him of treason, Edward was rewriting the political map. Scotland was to be seen not as an independent realm, but as a rebellious province. Wallace's trial was as much a claim to sovereignty as it was a prosecution. When asked for his plea, Wallace did not beg for mercy. According to chroniclers, he stated simply that he could not be a traitor to Edward, for he had never been Edward's subject. This was not defiance for its own sake. It was a deliberate rejection of the legal premise on which the trial rested. But in that chamber, the law was whatever the Crown declared it to be. There was no defense counsel, no presentation of witnesses on Wallace's behalf, no weighing of evidence. His fate had been sealed before he left Scotland. The proceedings served one purpose: to clothe vengeance in the robes of legality. Every word spoken in Westminster Hall that day was aimed at framing Wallace not as a freedom fighter, but as a criminal whose end would be both just and instructive. By mid-afternoon, the sentence was pronounced in full detail, with the audience leaning forward to catch every word. A death meant to strip away all honor and magnify shame. Wallace would be dragged through the streets of London, on a hurdle, a rough wooden frame, to the place of execution at Smithfield, hanged by the neck until nearly dead, cut down alive, castrated, and disemboweled, his entrails burned before his eyes, beheaded, his head displayed on London Bridge, quartered, with his limbs sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, Cannes, Stirling as warnings. Every stage was chosen not only for cruelty, but for symbolism. Dragging him through the streets would mark him as powerless. Hanging him alive would place him in the realm between life and death. The mutilation and quartering would serve as both a physical destruction of the man and political dismemberment of the cause he represented. The sentence was greeted with nods and murmurs from the court. In Edward's England, this was justice, swift, decisive, and public. The king himself did not need to be present. The machinery he had set in motion years before was working exactly as intended. Wallace was led back to his cell in the Tower to await the morning, when London's streets would become the stage for the final act. Dawn on the 23rd of August, 1305, broke gray over London. By the time the city's church bells began to toll, the streets between the Tower and Smithfield were already thick with people. Word had spread for days that William Wallace, the most notorious enemy of King Edward, would meet his end in full public view. For the crowd, this was not simply an execution. It was an event, a living spectacle of royal power. From the tower's gates, Wallace was bound to a hurdle, a rough wooden frame, dragged by a horse. The choice of the hurdle was deliberate. Criminals sentenced for treason were denied the dignity of walking to their death. He was pulled through the mire and refuse of London's streets, his body jolting and scraping with every rut in the road. The slow, rattling journey forced every market stall, every street corner, every window along the way to witness him. The shouts began early. Some cursed him for the raids into northern England, calling him butcher, thief, murderer. Others hurled refuse, rotten vegetables, and even stones. Yet, chroniclers note, there were those who watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. Perhaps Scots living in London, perhaps merchants from abroad, or perhaps simply men and women who found no joy in the spectacle. At Smithfield, the crowd pressed so tightly that sheriffs had to force a path for the hurdle. There, the full ritual of the sentence began. Wallace was hanged by the neck until he hovered at the edge of unconsciousness. He was cut down before death could claim him, revived with water, not out of mercy, but to ensure he was fully aware of what came next. The executioner then castrated him, severing the symbol of manhood and casting it into the fire. His abdomen was cut open, and the executioner reached in, pulling out his entrails and burning them before his eyes. To the medieval mind, this was the ultimate act of disgrace, the destruction of the body's integrity while the spirit was still trapped inside. Only when the agony had reached its intended crescendo was Wallace beheaded. The head, dripping with blood, would later be set on a spike above London Bridge, a warning to all who crossed the Thames that Edward's justice was not to be defied. The body was quartered, each limb sent to a different place where Wallace had fought: Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling. In this way, Edward scattered not only his enemies' remains, but the symbolic unity of his rebellion. No words from Wallace survive from that day. Some later legends claim he prayed, others that he called on God to witness his cause, others, still, that he stayed silent. What is certain is that his death was not meant to erase him quietly, but to make him unforgettable in the most brutal way possible. Yet, in a strange inversion of Edward's purpose, the execution did not kill Wallace's legacy. The sheer scale of the king's vengeance, the meticulous cruelty of the sentence, and the enduring fact that Wallace refused to recognize Edward's authority, all worked together to transform him from outlaw into martyr. Smithfield was supposed to be the place where Wallace's name ended. Instead, it became the place where his legend began. When the smoke from the fires at Smithfield drifted away, London returned to its daily life. But the story of William Wallace did not vanish with his body. If anything, his execution amplified his presence. Edward had meant to obliterate the man's memory, scattering his limbs across the realm as a warning. Instead, he ensured that Wallace's death would be retold in every corner of Scotland in the months after. August 1305. Rumors and stories crossed the border faster than royal proclamations. Merchants spoke of the spectacle in London. Sailors brought the tale to the East Coast ports. Traveling friars whispered the details in market squares. For Scots still resisting English rule, the cruelty of the execution became proof of Edward's tyranny. Even among some in England, the punishment struck a chord of unease, not for pity of Wallace, but for the ferocity with which the king had pursued a single man. Wallace's life was not one of compromise. He never swore allegiance to Edward, never accepted a royal pardon, never bargained for his own safety. That unyielding stance, costly though it was, became the heart of his legend. Chroniclers like Blind Harry, writing generations later, would weave his deeds into near-mythic epics, blending history with folklore until Wallace was both a man and a symbol. In these retellings, the details of Stirling Bridge, the night raids, and the defiance at Westminster Hall were heightened, sharpened, the flaws smoothed away, the courage magnified. Edward I himself would not live to see Scotland subdued. Within less than a decade of Wallace's death, Robert de Bruce would take up the fight, culminating in the victory at Bannockburn in 1314. Though Bruce's path was far different from Wallace's, the shadow of the earlier struggle was never far away. Wallace's refusal to bow had shown that resistance was possible. Even against the greatest military power in Christendom, over the centuries, the meaning of Wallace shifted. To some, he was the archetype of the patriotic martyr. To others, a reminder of the brutal realities of medieval war. Statues rose in Stirling and Aberdeen. His name was invoked in poetry, politics, and protest, and in every version of his story, from solemn chronicles to ballads sung in taverns, the final journey from Glasgow to London. The trial at Westminster and the agony at Smithfield remained the defining arc of his legend. Edward's justice had been absolute, but it had also been flawed in its purpose by turning Wallace's death into theater. The king ensured that it would be remembered, not as a triumph of law, but as a testament to defiance. In the end, the man who was paraded in chains through jeering streets would walk forever in the imagination of a nation unbowed, unbroken, and unforgotten.